All right. Thank you for the introduction, Harmony, and thank you for everyone who joined us today to spend a little of your, a little time during your lunch hour with us today to talk about what I think is a really big topic and will become a much bigger topic, as we'll talk about in the next year to a year and a half, as everybody starts to roll out and people become more aware of what's going on and the movements that are being made around the California Data Exchange Framework. So, we look at this both as a presentation, but also a conversation about, just in the larger sense, how do we move health information exchange in this state forward? Something that a lot of us, and I see a lot of familiar names and who's listening in today, a lot of us have been working on this topic and this issue area for a long time. And we're right at the precipice of doing some really big things. And, we want everyone to be aware and to be ready for what's coming. I also want to note this is a little bit of an experiment for CMA. There's a little different topics, a little different structure for a webinar than we normally do. We are a physician trade organization, but we do have a lot of membership in physician organizations, which many of you represent. And the data exchange framework happens to apply first to medium and large size medical groups. So we expanded who we approached for this webinar, and we'd love feedback. If this is helpful, what other topics could we do similar presentations on? That kind of feedback is great. I think Harmony is going to tell you a little later about how to give us that feedback. So with that introduction, let's jump right into it. Okay, so first of all, this is me. I carry two titles at CMA right now. Probably more relevant to this conversation, I am the Vice President of Health Information Technology here at CMA. I'm also currently the Interim Chief Executive Officer of CMA Physician Services, which is a subsidiary of CMA that helps small and safety net practices to adjust to changes in the marketplace, like the data exchange framework, by bringing them services and solutions to help them with that. Before I took this job at CMA, I was, and where some of you actually may know me from, is I was the executive director of an organization called CalHIPSO, which was the federally designated regional extension center for health IT for the vast majority of California, in fact, everywhere except Orange County and Los Angeles County. So that's a little bit about me. As I mentioned before, I've been around this data exchange work really since the early days of high tech, 12 or 13 years ago. And, excited to see how far we've come, and hopefully we can get this through the last mile. So let's talk about how we're going to do that. And through what is this thing that's called the California Data Exchange Framework. I took all these graphics actually off of the state's website. They've been very excited about the data exchange framework. They've been promoting it a lot, which may be where a lot of you have heard about it. But part of why I wanted to do this webinar is because the way this has been sold, both by the state and in some newspaper articles that have come out, have led to some confusion about what this is. Why was the state doing this? What are we actually driving towards with the data exchange framework? And I'm hoping to pull that curtain back today and demystify it a little bit. Because as you just read sort of the top headlines, I know a lot of folks that have been thinking that the state's out building a health information exchange and saying, well, why are we doing that? We already have health information exchanges. It's not exactly what we're doing here. And so I want to sort of talk through that with you today. So how are we going to do that? Here's our agenda for today's presentation. We'll start with some history and some overview of the data exchange framework. The history of how this came together at the state level is actually really, really important, especially as you sort of view how, what we're doing going forward, how we got to this point. There were sort of two movements that collided in the legislature last year. We'll talk more about that led us to this point. It's sort of a negotiated compromise, but when you know that history, you get a better sense of why we are where we are today and where we're going in the next couple of years as we keep promoting data exchange in the state. So after I go through that, I'll break down some big components of the data exchange, functionally how it works, what are the things that practices are going to need to be thinking about and doing. So we'll talk about those components. I do want to talk about the timelines because the timelines both very aggressive and we are sitting right at the precipice of some really big pieces of that timeline. Some of the biggest pieces of that timeline are actually in the next few days here. And while some of you may have heard of this and you may think the timelines sound not that aggressive, they may be more aggressive than you think. And we'll talk some more about that. And then I do want to leave enough time to answer your questions. As Harmony mentioned, you can be putting questions in the chat box directed to her during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll have open mic time. And what we'll ask at that point is that you use the raise hand function in Zoom so that we can open your mic selectively. We have a lot of people on this webinar, so I unfortunately can't just open everyone's mic and ask you to jump in. I will also give you my contact information. There's I believe a med group at cmadocs.org email address, but also give you my email address, and you're welcome to contact me after the presentation if you have more questions, if I didn't get to you, or if in the presentation my answer wasn't as clear as it could have been, because that will be on me. So let's go through it. So let's start with a little bit of history and overview. So let's start at the very basic level. As I mentioned before, it's important what the data exchange framework is and what it is not. So what it is, it's a legal framework that's centered around a data share, a unified data sharing agreement that is intended to facilitate exchange of health and human services data in California. So for those of you who have followed the federal movement, you know, TEFCA, the DRSA, or more locally, the CalDRSA, we are somewhat building on those, right? Those are also common agreements, legal frameworks to facilitate data exchange. So we are somewhat building on those, but we're adapting them for a different purpose here in California because the CalDRSA, TEFCA, those are largely meant to be agreements between organizations to exchange medical data. And in this case, we're talking about exchanging data among everyone. And we're also talking about different kinds of data because that human services data hasn't been as discussed in previous versions of data exchange. So that's what it is. We're trying to create a legal framework that just somewhat requires and also allows data exchange in this state to happen as much as possible. But I said it's also really important what it is not. We are not building a statewide health information exchange. And I'm kind of, if I sound a little keyed up on this point, it's because there's been some press stories about the data exchange framework. I linked to one of them here in my slides that have made it sound like that's what we're doing. In fact, they're titled like, California is building a health information exchange. That is not what we are doing. We have many functioning health information exchanges in the state already. There's no need to build new infrastructure. You know, we want to build on what's already happening. So, you know, some of you who follow these things nationally may know that there are other states, Maryland, for example, where there is a state health information exchange. Everyone, you know, one pool, everyone in the pool. That is not what we're doing here. And I think that's a really, really important piece of context. We're trying to build a structure that allows exchange between all the different networks that exist, and of course, new technologies that might come into the market. So how we got here, and this is important to understand that what actually came out and what became the data exchange framework was admittedly somewhat of a mishmash because we had two things going on in the legislature simultaneously last year. Senate Bill 371, carried by Senator Caballero. Full disclosure, CMA sponsored, had a heavy hand in creating that bill. we took sort of one approach to how we wanted to promote data exchange. Pretty heavy reliance on federal standards, national networks. The biggest piece we wanted to get done out of Senate Bill 371 was technical assistance support for small and safety net practices. Let's be honest, we all know that's really where a lot of the problem is a bunch of small practices and safety net practices that need a lot of help in both how to do this. They might need infrastructure upgrades. They might have EHRs that are not up to snuff to do data exchange. And so that's what we were really trying to get at, was how do we promote data exchange and how do we really bring those folks in to the larger world of data exchange. They are often, ironically, the ones who most need the data and the ones who have the hardest time getting the data. So that was really our focus. There was another bill, Assembly Bill 1131 by Jim Wood, that would have imposed a data sharing mandate, established a statewide health information network that included a single data repository. So very different view. That actually would have been more of a Maryland model of data exchange. Politically, these two bills are on a big collision course. You know, because one started in each house, and they were headed straight at each other as they switched houses, and it led to the possibility that politically both of them would have died in the alternate house and nothing would have gotten done. And that didn't really serve anybody's purposes, honestly. And so what happened is at the last minute, the Newsom administration stepped in and negotiated a truce that went into the state budget, which, if you're in this world, you might hear a lot of references to the AB 133, the AB 133 standards, AB 133 rules, et cetera, et cetera. So in Sacramento East, Assembly Bill 133 was the health trailer bill to the state budget. It was a policy bill that was passed along with the state budget last year that honestly took some pieces from both Senate Bill 371 and Assembly Bill 1131. But what's up on your screen is probably, for this conversation, the most relevant pieces of Assembly Bill 133. That basically said, there will be a data sharing mandate. There will not be a requirement that you use a particular system to do that data exchange. Excuse me. And as you see up here on the screen, it's a staggered implementation. The reason that CMA reached out to all of you is that you're from medium and large size medical groups. And as you see up on the screen, this actually applies to them first. So by January 31, 2024, which, boy, just not that far away, right about, 19 months from where we're sitting, all of the medium and large size medical groups, the vast majority of the FQHCs and RHCs, the health plans, everyone is actually going to be required to be exchanging data or to be making data available for exchange through the CHHS data exchange framework. And then as you see up there on the screen, the smaller physician practices, 25 and under, rehab hospitals, clinics with nonprofit clinics with fewer than 10 healthcare providers, a sort of little subset of folks gets an additional 2 years. And there's actually a very specific reason they get an additional 2 years. I'll get into that a little bit later, but for the most part, you can think of those two big dates, January 31, 2024, most people, January 31, 2026, small and safety net providers come in. So, you know, by 4 years from today, everyone in the state should be pretty actively engaged in data exchange under state law. This is another way to present the same information. You know, I just kind of broke it down into two columns. So everyone on the left is in the 2024 cohort. Everyone on the right is in the 2026 cohort. One thing I will mention here, and I'll come back to this again, there is a more pressing deadline So, which is that the state is going to be publishing a common data sharing agreement. And I'll talk a little more about it in sort of the next section of my presentation. As it sits right now, whether your entity is on the left or on the right, everyone has to execute the data sharing agreement by January 31, 2023. So what, about 7 months from right now. So they have to execute basically sign the data sharing agreement in January of next year to be ready to go by January of the following year. Now, we have had some conversations with the state about whether for that group on the right, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to make them sign an agreement in January of next year and then not have to implement it for 3 years. So the state seems amenable to that. We're hoping we can work something out there. It's basically a quirk in how the law is written right now. Probably doesn't apply to most of the people listening today, but for most of you, you're going to be in that cohort on the left. So again, sign January of next year, implement January of 2024. A couple more things about Assembly Bill 133. The term the state used in AB 133 is technology agnostic. That's back to that idea that we are not creating a state HIE. And we are not saying you have to do data sharing through this particular system. We hope to use we're going to use common standards, predominantly the federal standards for data exchange, so that we make sure all the systems are up to snuff and can work with all of the other systems, but not saying one network. I already mentioned the data sharing agreement. That's a template agreement all actors will sign. To implement this, the state did create a stakeholder advisory group along with some subcommittees that has been meeting for about the last, I think it's about 9 months now, to advise the state on how this should all be implemented. And then, as I mentioned before, I believe the plan, all of it, the state's plan for governance, the data sharing agreement, all of it, it all has to be published, and it's a statutory deadline, July 1st, 2022, which, as we're sitting here on the 28th of June, you've probably already figured out means this whole thing is going to be published by the state in 3 days. And so we really are sitting on the edge of this all coming together. Just a little bit about that advisory group. They were named in the fall of 2021. Their final scheduled meeting was a week ago on the 23rd. There is now a discussion that came up at the last advisory group meeting about some new subcommittees and advisory groups that are going to be formed. This was they viewed this as sort of the planning phase advisory group, and now there's going to be an implementation phase advisory group with some subgroups underneath it. You can watch it, if that's something your organizations are interested in, you can follow the links that I put in this slide deck will be available after the presentation. You can follow some of those links to find out how those are being named, how those new subgroups are being named. But more information on that as it's available. I did sit on the advisory group for the last 9 months representing CMA. We also had the hospital association, the public hospitals, the health plans, county behavioral health directors. There were about 40 or 50 people on the group. It was a big organization with a lot of very disparate views on data exchange. And so we hopefully came out with something of a good product. There was one formal subcommittee. There was a group, I believe I see some names of some of you who sat on this group that actually did work out the details of the template data sharing agreement. There were also some focus groups on digital identity, which is sort of a newer term. It's what traditionally we call patient matching, but they used a broader term, digital identity. And you can follow that link when you get the slide deck to see the work of the advisory group. So I mentioned I would come back to the timeline. This is the whole timeline from when AB 133 was passed on the left, all the way over to when those safety net providers come into data exchange in January of 2026. Where we are right now is right about there. As I mentioned, July 1, we'll see a big final report out from the Centers for Data Insight and Innovation within the state that will have all of the components of the data exchange framework as we now know them. And then, as you can see, as you move across January of next year, everyone has to execute the data sharing agreement. January 31, 2024 is when we start implementation. And I'll come back to this timeline because there's a little more detail to this, but I wanted to sort of give everyone a sense of where we are right now. I get this question a lot. Why are we doing this? Don't we do a lot of data exchange in this state? A lot of people tell me, my organization, we have Epic and we get all of this data through care quality. Why do we need this data exchange framework? A lot of it, and this was a big aha moment to me about halfway through the advisory group process, which is that the state is really, really, really focused on CalAIM. I assume everyone knows about CalAIM. It is the next version of the Medi-Cal waiver. It's this big reform of Medi-Cal that will involve doing a lot of data exchange between the medical world and a bunch of community-based organizations, county public health departments, housing departments, et cetera, et cetera. And the big thing about all those organizations that are now going to be involved because of CalAIM is that none of them are covered by HIPAA or CMIA, or at least the vast majority of them are not. And there really isn't a legal framework that allows for data exchange between a bunch of HIPAA and CMIA covered entities with a bunch of non-HIPAA covered entities. And there really isn't sort of a good framework for how to do that. And that's really what the state is trying to create here, is trying to set up the legal framework and the standards that facilitate that exchange, because we're going to have to. And that's really where a lot of this came from the state's perspective, is really facilitating CalAIM. I will say, having said that, I am not an expert on CalAIM. I know just enough to be dangerous, but basically it's, in case anyone's not familiar, CalAIM is really focused on incorporating what we term social determinants of health into clinical data streams. So, the Medi-Cal managed care plans are now going to be asked to coordinate things like housing, food security, all of those social determinants that we've talked about for so long. And that's really what it is. All that stuff is going to flow through the Medi-Cal managed care plans. If that all works, great, because then physicians have access to all kinds of information about their patients they've never had before. But it does involve exchange of data between a bunch of entities that have not traditionally exchanged data. The other piece of this is, especially for those of us, those of us who kind of live in the medical space, is the federal information blocking rules, right? Much of what's in the data exchange framework, physicians, hospitals, health plans are already subject to because of the information blocking rules. As you know, there's two federal rules really that matter here, the 21st Century Cures Act rule and the Patient Access and Interoperability final rule. A lot of data sharing, we're already under data sharing requirements. We had a question in the pre-webinar questions about progress notes, and are we going to have to exchange progress notes? The answer is yes, and that actually has nothing to do with the data exchange framework. That's already in the federal rules that made clinical notes open to exchange and to release to the patient. It's a complicated issue area. CMA actually is doing legislation right now, Senate Bill 1419, to try to figure out if, because the federal rules defer to state law, how we can put maybe some parameters around the release of progress notes, because they do sometimes contain really sensitive information. But in general, yes, you do have to be releasing those because of the information blocking rules, not because of the data exchange framework. But to a certain extent, I believe CDII actually views the data exchange framework as a component of the state's implementation of those federal rules, because that data exchange is already required. So let's talk about the components, the big pieces of the data exchange framework. Two big things I want to talk about. The state is proposing to create a governance entity that they have described as a covered California-like body that will administer the data sharing agreement, update the policies and procedures around data exchange as needed. And then, as I've mentioned, a single data sharing agreement that all organizations will be required to execute. As I get into these components, I do want to say one thing is really important, especially because I was a member of the advisory group, which is please don't shoot the messenger here as you're asking questions or as you're preparing to ask me questions at the end of the presentation. If you followed this process at all in the advisory group, CMA and with our colleagues in the provider world has actually been pretty critical of what's being proposed by the state. We think there's actually some pretty serious problems with it that we're hoping that we can continue working with the state to fix. But as I describe this, I am relaying information here. I am not an advocate here, and I just want that to be clear. So the governance entity, this is just an infographic of generally what the governance of the data exchange framework looks like. So where we sit right now is like kind of on the left. California Health and Human Services, what's called CDII, Center for Data Insights and Innovation, and then these advisory groups and subcommittees will basically organize the initial implementation of the data exchange framework. But as I mentioned, the state does actually want to create a policy board that's over here on the right. Now, the timing of this will be interesting and how this happens. The state, by their own admission, does not have legal authority to create this HIE policy board as it sits right now. That would have to go back to the legislature. And as you see here, their timing is they want to do it by, they're talking about January 2023. That means they've either got to do something really rushed in the legislature right now, through some sort of last minute move, or they need to fold it into some state budget trailer bill, or they would have to come back next year and do something super duper rushed in the beginning of the new session with the new legislature after the election. So we'll see. All of those it's not clear which way they're going to go with that right now. Basic structure, as I mentioned, to be determined, because there is going to have to be follow-up legislation on how to create this governance entity. The proposal, like the Covered California Board, it would be chaired by the Secretary of HHS, and then with some appointments by the governor and appointments by the legislature. So very much the same structure of many other governing boards. One thing that is interesting, they have proposed that the board members will be subject to strict conflict of interest policies. That also they've borrowed from Covered California. There's always that balance, right? Of, I can understand that you don't want people to be financially invested in decisions that a board like this will make. And at the same time, you need people who, to put it at a very basic level, know what they're talking about when they make decisions, especially in something like this that is so technical. So that's going to be a really tricky balancing act, and it has been for Covered California as well, is finding people who can sort of thread that needle. They did base, I mentioned Covered California, they also sort of patterned this off of the Emergency Medical Services Authority, and they looked at some models in other states that do have HIE governing boards right now. The functions of this governance entity, I'm not going to read through all these. I will point out on the next, and as I click through this a little bit, I will point out some of the specific ones here, but there's a lot, so I don't want to read them all. And I'm sorry, they're kind of small on your page. So hopefully you'll be able to read them better when we send out the slide deck. But let's mention a few that I think are important. Development and modifications to data sharing agreement policies and procedures. So this board will have, we'll create this template data sharing agreement that we're going to see on Friday. And then this board will get to change it moving forward. And I'll talk about some of how that's going to function. But this board is going to be really important for those of us who are involved in data exchange going forward. Enforcement and monitoring of compliance with policies and procedures, requirements, and guidelines. So this will be a regulatory board. Then it's not exactly clear how enforcement will work. CMA has suggested that enforcement of anything that has to do with physicians should remain at the Medical Board of California, where it belongs, and the Osteopathic Medical Board, because let's not forget our colleagues on that side. But that will at least start with this board if someone is not complying with the rules around data exchange. And then this one, identification and qualification of data exchange intermediaries. What they're actually talking about here is the HIOs and the national networks and the other entities that facilitate data exchange. The problem that we see over and over again with something like this, when it rolls out, is that you may have all kinds of new technologies that come out and say, oh, we can help you be compliant with that. We're a data exchange. And some of them may be really good. And that's the positive view on this, is that you may spur some real innovation as people are like, oh, everyone has to be exchanging data. Let's come up with some new way to do it, some new technology that makes it easier, faster, better. Great. But there also may be some stuff that comes into the marketplace that's not so great when stuff like this happens. And we saw this with electronic health records. There was a lot of, when high tech rolled out, there was a lot of innovation. There were new EMRs that came out, and there still are new variations on the EHR. We also saw a bunch of fly-by-night companies that sprung up because they heard there was money to be made, and they disappeared pretty quickly. And a lot of physicians got left holding the bag. So we have to strike that balance again, where we want to make sure that if someone's going to hold themselves out as an HIE or say, we can help facilitate data exchange, that they're meeting the standards and that they actually can do what they say they do. And at the same time, not make it so restrictive that we take, we cut players out of the marketplace. So that's going to be a really tricky one to follow. Okay, second component, the single data sharing agreement. And I probably need to speed up a little bit because I know that we are getting close to question time, so I'll try to talk a little faster. In general, there is the template data sharing agreement that everyone will have to execute, and then there's 8 policies and procedures documents. The idea behind this is that because the data sharing agreement is a contract, you don't want to have to change the main contract every time there's a change to the rules. So they create the policies and procedures documents so that as things change, as the market changes, as there needs to be updates, those can all be done in the policies and procedures. I mentioned before, must be executed by, quote, Health and Human Service organizations by January 31 of next year. I will state, because the vast majority of who's on this call are medical groups, I did clarify this piece with the state from a question that came up on another call I was on when I was presenting about this. So for medical groups, this is actually signed by the entity, not individual physicians. So, XYZ Medical Group does not need to go and get every individual physician who is a member of XYZ Medical Group to sign this. Signed once by the medical group on behalf of the member physicians. As I mentioned before, this is loosely based on TEFCA and the CalDERSA. That had to be changed because it serves a little bit of a different purpose. The policies and procedures, as they sit right now, these are the 8 policies and procedures documents. Again, there's a lot, so I don't want to go through these one by one. Most of these are exactly what you would think they are. I mean, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time explaining process for amending the TSA. It's exactly what it says it is. But those are the 8 documents as they stand right now. But I will point out a few important components and then a few open items that need to be discussed. So as the document sits right now, in a plain reading of the document, the DSA can be changed by, and the policies and procedures can be changed by the governance entity at any time with 180 days notice. So they would publish an update, you would have 180 days to implement it. One of the things we've, well, and I'll get to that on the next slide. To answer a question that was asked in the pre-webinar questions, it's important because this was a clarification we had with the state. Because the data sharing agreement is an agreement, the state is taking the position that it is governed by contract law, not the Administrative Procedures Act. So, the Medi-Cal policy manual, and when it's updated, it goes through the Administrative Procedures Act, it's published as a regulation, there's a comment period, et cetera, et cetera. This does not go through the Office of Administrative Law. It is a process that is wholly owned within the governance entity, and while there is an open process that is in the DSA, it does not have to go through an Office of Administrative Law review. Now, again, that's a point that has become quite contentious with the state and the provider world. We've asked that it function a little bit more like the Medicare physician fee schedule, once a year updates on some sort of predictable schedule so that the market can adjust to it. We haven't quite been heard on that point yet. And I did want to point out, as it's written right now, the DSA does require use of, for those of you who are in the weeds on this a little bit, it does require the use of US CDI version 2. So you may know that the federal rules require US CDI version 1 right now. This one jumps ahead to version 2. My understanding is the reason the state wants to go to version 2 is because that includes things like sexual orientation and gender identity data that aren't in version 1. And so they're kind of skipping ahead on the feds on that one. Some open items and some things that will still need to be discussed. Delegation. So as I mentioned, in a medical group, most of the ones you guys are representing, it'll be signed once by the entity. You don't need to chase around a bunch of individual physicians to sign it. What's sort of less clear is what happens when we get into things like IPAs, where the physicians aren't quite as integrated, or they may have, there are entities that have some employed physicians, but then affiliate physicians in an IPA structure. Or they have an IPA and some of the physicians are on their standard license EMR and some of them aren't. I just think that world's going to get very murky very fast. It always does with these things. And there's going to be a lot left to sort out there. As I mentioned, updates to policies and procedures. That's one where I think it might get a little testy for a while. We can't have the governance entity making changes anytime they just sort of feel like it, or anytime someone, some activist group gets a burr under their saddle to raise some issue. There have to be some timelines, there have to be predictability in how updates to this are made so that the market can adjust, the vendors can program their systems, et cetera, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned before, that definition of qualified health information organization and that tricky balance that we're going to have to strike on what that actually looks like. So let's talk about next steps. I'm going to go back to this timeline that I showed you before. As I mentioned, right now we're here. And the whole plan for the data exchange framework will be published on July 1, or this Friday. From there, January 31, everyone has to sign the data sharing agreement. 2024, most providers have to implement the data exchange framework. And then January 2026, everybody else, all those smaller and safety net practices. The latest developments, there are drafts of a lot of the plan up on the CDII website right now. I put some links in here. These are, when you get the slide deck, these are hot links that you can click on if you want to look at the data sharing agreement policies and procedures as they stand right now. There's also a draft of that digital identity strategy and how they're going to do patient matching. And then very recently, the state budget, it looks like it survived into the final state budget agreement. So while the state is building the legal structure for the governance entity, they actually have 18 proposed FTEs in the budget, this being passed tomorrow, I believe, to begin staffing up to get ready. Now there is also, this was really important to CMA, there is $50 million in the budget for HIE technical assistance for those smaller and safety net practices to fund folks to go out and really help them do this. I think, as you know, in those practices, it's very challenging to get them to work something like this into clinical workflow when they don't have IT departments and, you know, medical directors and those folks who can work on those things. We're really going to have to go in and help them do it. So the governor needs to sign the budget by Thursday, which is why the legislature is passing it tomorrow. Friday, CDII will publish the whole data exchange framework, including the template DSA. And then July 31st, that digital identity strategy is published. That is not really covered by the statutory deadline, so it can go a little bit while they do that really important work. So really over the next, you know, whatever that is, you know, the next 4 days, we're going to get a lot of really information about how this is all going to work and how it's going to come together. Some places for some more information. CMA will be providing a summary of the data exchange framework when it is published on Friday. So I'll be pulling it apart, taking out relevant pieces and slapping them together into a fact sheet, and that we will get out as quickly as we can to member organizations. We are still a member-driven entity. And so for those of you who are in groups who have a membership presence within CMA, you can be watching for that. For those of you who don't, my colleagues who are on this webinar with me would love to talk to you about correcting that oversight, so you can get more information like that. The CMA website is cmadocs.org, and then I put a link there to the State Data Exchange Framework website as well. Whoops. One more just quick shameless plug, because the folks who are on this webinar today are all in medium and large size medical groups. Our annual medical group symposium is coming up at the end of August, the Westin in Pasadena. We have a great lineup of speakers. Paul Markovich, the president and CEO of Blue Shield. You see Elizabeth Mitchell from Purchaser Business Group on Health. Dustin Corcoran, the CEO of CMA. And to really sweeten the pot, a speech on the future of health IT from this handsome devil. So you can come and hear me again if you come to the group symposium in August. So with that, I think I hit my timeline almost exactly, and I will be happy to take some questions.